Hi everyone! I just wanted to do a really quick video today on a problem that I've had multiple times lately. And I literally just finished the stitching on this binding to attach it to the front of my quilt. And look at this fraying! It's terrible! Now, I am using this cotton sateen as my binding. It's the same Tula Pink bananas backing that I used on the quilt. And this happens a lot with sateen. I don't use it a lot for bindings, but this top is so crazy that I thought it'd be good here. It's also happened to me a couple times with just regular 40-inch width fabric, but this is quite a problem. And just handling this, it's fraying more and more. So I just wanted to talk about a solution for this so that you can get this stitched down, especially if you're hand binding it, which you're kind of moving it around and touching it a lot. You want to get this solved before you enclose it so that your binding doesn't end up kind of coming undone. So there are two ways to deal with this problem. The first is by serging the edge. So that's what I'm going to do, and then we'll talk about the other option. So I'm just going to move over to my serger and show you how well that cleans up this edge. So we have our quilt, our fraying quilt, at our serger. And I have just kind of angled it so that I can kind of merge onto the edge as I go. Now, this is the blade of the serger, this kind of dark gray rounded thing. I don't actually want to cut any of my quilt off, but I am going to let it trim all these little hairs. And I'm going to keep the edge of the quilt here aligned with the edge of the foot, this kind of shiny part right here, which is just inside the blade. So I'm just going to ease on, kind of straighten it out, and stitch along the edge of the quilt here. Make sure my foot is down. Make sure your foot is down when you're serging. If you don't, then your machine will probably come unthreaded, which I just had to deal with and is not fun. Now, as you come to the corner, so this is the fold of my binding corner, and I do not want to serge this down. Okay, you want to just kind of hold it out of the way, and we're just going to kind of veer off the edge of the quilt because we don't want to stitch this corner down. So I'm just going to get pretty close, and then I'm going to veer right off the edge. See how the serge lines kind of go off, and now this corner is still free. So now I'm going to just turn my quilt and put the next surface right under there and serge down this side. So after all that, here's what we have. We have serged all the way around our quilt, except for those corners. Remember, don't sew down this folded corner of your binding. Just skip that little bit, and I think 1/2 inch of fraying is something we can deal with. But that's it. There are some other benefits to serging your edging down. I think it does make your quilt a little bit more secure, and especially if you're working with fabrics that do tend to fray a little bit. If I was making a quilt for a baby that I knew was going to be washed like a million times, I might go ahead and serge the edge of the quilt just as an added layer of security. The other benefit is I used a wool batting on this quilt, and you can see it is quite a thick batting. It's Quilter's Dream wool, and so it's super puffy. So serging does kind of squish down the edge of the quilt to make it just a little bit easier to kind of wrap the binding around and get it stitched down. So if you're using, especially if you're doing like a double batting that's like very thick, there's a lot of hand fatigue that comes with hand binding. So anything you can do to make this a little bit flatter and a little bit easier to deal with, if you have a serger, then definitely go ahead and do it. So now let's discuss some options if you don't have a serger. Now, you can also go around the edge of your quilt with a zigzag stitch. Use kind of a wide zigzag stitch and align your stitch so that the left needle comes down, you know, somewhere between the edge of the quilt and your stitching line that you attached your binding to. And then the right side of the zigzag goes off the edge of the quilt. So you'd be stitching, you know, needle down here, needle off the quilt, needle on the quilt, needle off the quilt. And that will kind of make kind of like a fake serged line because the thread will wrap around the edge of the quilt. And that's just a nice tip for kind of a fake serged line. Now, your sewing machine may have a foot that looks kind of like this with these 3 bars. Now, this foot is for my Janome 8900, and it's foot letter M. And this is an overstitch foot. So if you have one of these, this is a great alternative to a serger. And what it does is basically your thread is going to come and kind of wrap around these wires as you stitch, and then it will feed off the back. These wires are loose here to allow it to feed off. And that will create a thread that, much like the zigzag, is going to wrap around the edge of the quilt. You can see there's a guide right here. So your quilt will be guided along the edge, and then the thread will wrap around those wires. And that'll create kind of a wrapped edge like this. Now, the only real advantage to a serger over using an overstitch or over edge foot is that there are 4 or sometimes more. My serger has 4 threads, but some sergers have 6 threads that make it just a little bit more secure. There's also, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's 2 lines of stitching or on a serger machine. And so there's 2 threads on the top and 2 threads that create all these loops on the bottom. So it's just a little bit more secure than the 2 threads that are involved in your sewing machine. Sergers are also quite a bit faster and louder, just as a nice little benefit. So that is how to deal with fraying binding fabric. Now I'm going to go ahead and press this to prepare it for hand stitching, but you can see that once this is stitched down, no one will ever know that you had to take that little extra step. But you'll be happy because you'll know your quilt isn't going to fall apart and it's not going to make a mess while you're trying to hand stitch it. So that's just a little quick tip. I hope you enjoy. Happy quilting!